So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this EU-Canada platform webinar on the opportunities and challenges to the labor market integration of migrant women. My name is Thomas Liebig. I'm Senior Migration Specialist at the OECD, and will be your moderator for this afternoon. I'll start with a brief introduction to the topic. And this is actually an issue to which there has been emerging attention being paid across OECD countries, both in Europe and in Canada. And the reasons are actually plentiful. First of all, there's lots of unused potential in migrant women, because we see that the employment outcomes often lag behind, and notably their labor market participation is well below those of migrant men, but also well below that of native-born women. At the same time, there are a very large group. Actually, the majority of migrants in most countries are women. At the same time, they're underrepresented among the flows. So how do you explain that? Well, the reason is they generally come as family migrants, and family migrants tend to stay longer. So while there's a lot of turnover among migrant men, there's a lot less turnover for migrant women. So even more reason, you would say, to do a lot about the integration, right? But actually, if you look at it more closely, there has not really been a focus among integration efforts in many OECD countries, both in the EU and in Canada, unless a relatively recent past, I would say. It was often taken as a fate, as a choice, that migrant women do not work, and there was nothing to do about it. This is unfortunately changing, and it's changed a lot over the recent years, because we cannot obtain the inclusion targets, be it in Canada, be it in Europe, without doing better for this group, without doing better for migrant women, given the large gaps that we're having here. And doing better for migrant women is also a prerequisite for doing better in the integration of native-born children, because there's a strong link between empowering migrant women and having better integration of their children. The issue of migrant women is obviously closely related to the issue of family, and actually it's something that I would like to hear also more from our panel, which I will introduce in a minute. How does it actually link? I mean, to which degree is it really a gender issue, or to which degree is it an issue that migrant women generally don't come as labor migrants, but they come as family migrants joining a principal migrant? So they come through that family channel, and to which often there's less access to integration measures, and there's less attachment to the labor market as well. And as we'll see later on, certainly, family responsibilities are a particular challenge for migrant women. One of the most surprising things, perhaps, that we have seen at the OECD in terms of our research on integration was that actually integration measures actually matter more for migrant women than for migrant men. And in particular, building basic skills to succeed in the labor market gives an enormous boost to the employment chances, actually much more than for migrant men. So with that little introduction, I'm very pleased to introduce our four panel speakers today. First of all, Jürgen Schröder from the German Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Jürgen has been working in the Ministry, German Federal of Labor and Social Affairs, since 1991, after a previous position actually in Eastern German Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. And among other things, he's responsible for projects to promote language skills and professional integration of migrants. And he's also in charge of international cooperation in the area of labor market integration. And among other tasks, he has been a member to the Metropolis Steering Committee since 2013, and is also a close friend to the OECD. Then we have Fatima Yassir from the Flemish Public Employment Service, from the DAB, the Flemish Public Employment Service. In this role, as a policy and strategy advisor, she works to define the right strategies and services to deal with particular challenges for migrant inclusion in the labor market, And inclusive entrepreneurship actually has been a key issue for her. So you will guess what kind of session she's going to be moderating in the breakouts later on. In 2019, she also co-edited the management book, Zero Exclusion, Inclusion as the DNA of the Innovative Organization. And the whole issue of inclusion and diversity run as a red thread through her role in both the public and non-profit and non-profit sector. Then we move over to the other side of the Atlantic, and it's a pleasure to have with us Olga Stachova, who is the CEO of Mosaic, a registered charity serving migrant and mainstream communities in the Canadian province of British Columbia. As a migrant woman to Canada herself, Olga has over 20 years of experiences in managing nonprofit organization, and she has also operational expertise in program design, delivery, and evaluation regarding the inclusion of diverse groups, and in particular, migrant women. And last but not least, it's a pleasure to have with us David Kashevac, who is a director in the Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada's Settlement and Integration Policy branch. Right now, he's serving as Senior Director for Horizontal Policy and Programs in that integration branch. Prior to that, he has been working with the immigration side, actually working as director in different positions, including, and this is particularly relevant here, as we will see, with responsibility for family unification. So to start this debate, I would like to start perhaps with a question to Jürgen. Jürgen, what do you think is the right benchmark? I mean, like when we define migrant women's labor market integration, what is a successful integration? What's the right benchmark here? Is the right benchmark that they reach the same level and conditions as native women, which is obviously quite a high benchmark to put? Or do we put the benchmark as migrant men, because gender equality among migrants? Or native men with the same level of education? That would be an even more ambitious goal. Or when we just say, well, when the employment condition is just as good as it was in the origin, and then we're happy with it. Or is it perhaps that they should be meeting the goals that they have established for themselves? So, Jürgen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? It's my picture is frozen. Sorry for that. I don't know why. But yes, Thomas, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for the introduction. That's a very interesting question. And you know, I work for the German Ministry for Labor and Social Affairs. And so the main focus from our ministry is to look for the labor market situation, especially for the migrant and for the migrant women. And what we learned in the past, also in the actual situation over the COVID-19, is that especially people with lower qualification or special groups of migrants, for example, women, are had more problems to find the access in the labor market or to stay in the labor market in the moment. And if we look to the situation in Germany, the employment rates in 2019 for a woman, 61% was in the employment rates in 2019 was 61%, and for a man 81%, and German women 77%. Employment rate of foreign women is also 16 or 20% below that of German women or foreign men. Only this comparison enables certain results to be classified. In my opinion, labor market policy or individual measures are then more successful when it is possible to bring more migrant women in the regular system or in the system for special qualification measures and qualification programs. And the labor market situation in the countries of origin can also be taken into account of the assessment. Often, however, this is more likely to take place at the individual level and is difficult to generalize. For example, a person who has fled in the age of 14 did no work in their country of origin before fleeing, that does not necessarily facilitate integration in Germany and the whole society or in the labor market. And that means that we have to look closely at the life situation of women, what requirements they have, and what specific help we can offer to facilitate the access to the labor market and to integrate it in the whole society Thank you
very much, Jürgen. So taking into account the individual circumstances, but also the country of origin context, so a little bit of mix of the different things. Olga, what is your view on this issue from a Canadian NGO perspective, so to say?
Thank you, Thomas, and good morning to everyone from Vancouver. I'm joining you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I would argue that we consider labor market integration as successful if newcomer women meet the goals that they establish for themselves. But we also need to understand that those goals will change over time. I don't think we can underestimate the challenge of relocating to a new country and having to build and rebuild your social professional networks in a new environment, in a new language, and often under new cultural norms. In Canada, recent immigrant women are more likely to have children than native-born women, and traditionally are the main caregiver. As a settlement service provider, we see that successful integration of their children is often the primary goal. And newcomer women would choose not to work or work part-time until their children are well settled in their schools. And there are a number of programs in Canada to support this integration into schools, which is almost like a prerequisite for newcomer women's ability to pursue meaningful participation in the market. At the same time, we work with many newcomer women whose goal it is to immediately find employment that is commensurate to their education and experience. And in that case, if that's the desire, the goal should be achieving the same level of conditions of employment as native women, as immigrant men and native men with the same level of educations. But of course, studies have shown that it takes immigrant women longer to integrate into the labor market force than men. Women are also twice as likely to work in part-time jobs, but only 30% of them report that childcare as a reason. And employed immigrant women also earn less than they in comparison to Canadian-born women. But in particular in Canada, over the past number of years, we've noticed the visible minority newcomer women have the lowest labor market participation rates and the highest unemployment rate. And for us to understand the gaps and understand the motivation, we need to understand the motivations and the personal situation. And I have to give a lot of credit to the Canadian government for wanting to actually understand the numbers and the data. The poor labor market outcomes on visible minority newcomer women actually triggered a direct response from the government and a series of pilot projects across the country that are active now to understand the issue and test the effectiveness of various interventions. So it's really about collecting and reviewing the right disaggregate data regularly and be able to actually dissect and consider the various intersectional identities of the target population. It's about taking action when we see that there's a group that is being left behind. And it's about having clarity of what the benchmark is and what we are comparing to appropriately assess the gap.
Thank you, Olga. I found that very interesting to what you mentioned with respect to that the goals also change over time. I think that's a very important point you make, that the benchmarks also have to be adjusted, and that we should also the issue of childcare, while obviously not underestimating it either. Mm-hmm. And digging a little bit deeper into this issue of the double disadvantage. Migrant women in the labor market, as we've seen also in the figures that Jürgen has shown for Germany, and we see this across countries, there is a double disadvantage, right? There's a migrant-specific and a gender-specific, and these two not only accumulate, but there's also what we would say an interaction effect, because the gender gaps in employment tend to be larger for migrants than for the native-born. So there's actually more than just a double disadvantage. And clearly, as was also mentioned, there are some issues related to the gender disparities in origin countries, as both of you mentioned. But at the same time, we also see that good policies can have a huge effect on this group. The employment levels for immigrant women in Canada, Sweden, and Norway are much higher than for the native-born, actually, in a number of countries like Belgium, Ireland, Italy, or Spain. So while there clearly are challenges, there's perhaps also something that's related to policy. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Fatima. What do you think? Is it that they have specific challenges other than just a accumulation of migrant and gender-specific ones, or is it more that actually our policies, present or past, or the attention being paid by employment services and others has not been sufficient in the past or now? Fatima, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas, also for the introduction and the great question. And I'm glad to see that, I'm happy to see that in Belgium, for example, we are going towards reflecting on the policy, on the systems, instead of focusing on the target groups like we did in the past. And we need to focus on them, but we tend to now look at the barriers instead of, just looking at women in general with migrant background. What is the problem? So we look at what is our problem, what is the system like, and as you know, the policies are usually tailored based on standard models. For example, childcare, we're going to have the standard family, a mom and a dad and 2 children and born here, and knowing the system, and based on that we're going to design our processes, our services, our project. But the problem is combined with the fact also that the persons or the people, the teams that design these processes until up to date is still not really inclusive. It's really homogenic. So you have all these things that create bias into our systems and to our structures, which creates, in fact, exclusion of certain people because we focus on these standard models, let's say. So we tend to go, and I'm happy to see that the change it's really coming to look at what kind of systems are we building, what kind of services are we building, and instead of thinking of unconscious bias that we all have as humans, which is really natural, and to not consider this a taboo, but just to say we are all by default as humans are biased. So we need to be conscious that this bias runs into our systems, in our services, in our processes. So how can we challenge that? And you can challenge that by, this is the principle of universal design. When you design a product or a system or service, you need to build in as soon or as early as possible in your design process that the right people can give feedback and input. So create these inclusive advisory groups or focus groups, so you get the input. How is the product or your service perceived? Are there mechanisms built in that maybe for the common Belgian, I will say now, is evident? It's like you don't even think about it, but for certain people, these create exclusion mechanisms. And if you take the vulnerable people as your model of your reference, then you make sure that your service is inclusive for many people. But if you keep focusing on the middle target group, the standard models, then you have a lot of people that will be unconsciously excluded. So I think I'm happy also to see that at VDIB, at the PES, we are going this way. We are focusing on the system and seeing what structural barriers do we create by having these kind of biases, and how do we hear the voices of the most vulnerable people to make our processes and services as inclusive as possible.
Thank you, Fatima. I think that's obviously would be great to elaborate, but perhaps we have a little bit more time than in the breakout session to elaborate a little bit more on what you're exactly doing in VDIB to kind of put that in practice. But I take one key lesson to design the policies with the groups concerned, to have that inclusive reflection also in terms of what are the institutional barriers, and I think that's a very important point, and that actually brings me to the next issue that I'd like to discuss. Starting with David, what is the right timing and measures mix? We have a lot of integration measures that focus on new arrivals. But for migrant women, actually, this is perhaps not necessarily the right moment for policy intervention, because especially when they have family responsibilities. So what are some of the good practices that you're pursuing in Canada for migrant women regarding the timing of such measures while still making sure that they're not left behind. David, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Bonjour, good morning. Pleasure to be here with you all today. I think that's a great question, Thomas, and I think we're starting to hear even from the panelists around how important that it's that link, right? We're saying because we know that newcomer women are disproportionately responsible for a lot of the caregiving, the childcare, at least at arrival. Knowing that that's a bit of the continuum allows us to put in place the supports, but also the programmatic interventions to deal with it. I think, you know, on our program, on the settlement and resettlement assistance program side, you know, what we're really trying to put in place is a range of supports across that migration journey, from arrival into that sort of space before they acquire a Canadian citizenship. You know, so at least knowing that there's a continuum and an offer there that is there, and it continues to be there, that at least it empowers women and newcomer women to avail themselves of the kind of programming that makes most sense at the point in the continuum they're at. And I think that's something that we heard Olga mention it as well. I think something that you know, we want to make sure you know, that we're designing those interventions to face barriers that include stuff like transportation and getting to the place where services are provided, but also looking at the issues of the special supports for people who may be supporting a family member with a disability, the issues of translation and interpretation, the issue of childcare and short-term counseling. So a lot of these interventions at different points in time, and really I think are there to come in at the right time. On mix, I think you sort of talked about timing on mix, and I think this is maybe a bit beyond the question, but I think one of the things that we're really when it comes to some of the measurement issues that you mentioned right at the outset, Thomas, you know, I think part of our ultimate goal, at least in the program we have, is to aim for full participation, and not just the economic, and often that's what we measure, not just economic, but also social, cultural, and political life. You know, and I think this is maybe taking a step back, and when we look at the mix of what we're doing and how we intervene, COVID-19 and the pandemic is something where I think it forces us to take a bit of a step back and look at the disproportionate impacts. When we look at, you know, women workers in Canada, 56% of women workers are concentrated in what we call the 5C occupations: caring, cashiering, catering, cleaning, and clerical functions. And we see that 70% of all job losses after the pandemic very concentrated in those kinds of areas. So when we talk about the timing, it's always going to be that timing of the intervention and the nature of the intervention. I think the pandemic is really putting a light on what else do we need to, how do we think this through, and what else do we need to do really specifically to target where the impacts have been most disproportionately felt. Thanks, I'll leave it there, thanks.
Thank you, David. I think that's a very good point also to stress the particular challenges of the pandemic for migrant women, given the nature of jobs that they're facing, and they, on one side they're on the front line sometimes, but on the other hand they're also in the more vulnerable jobs that are vulnerable both ends. Vulnerable because they have more contact with clients, you cannot telework, but also more vulnerable in terms of job loss. Fatima, what is your views on this issue of the measures mix?
So we did some research last year on women that are professionally inactive, and what came across, which is really I think interesting, is the fact that there is a need for this today. It's a gray area in between. Either you have a job or you don't have a job. There's a whole spectrum of things that we can do, and that these women would like to do, like trying to work small hours or voluntary work or learning. So I think we don't want this to be a gray area. This should be like recognized, validated. So how can we stimulate women with respect to their position and the fact that they are just settling in and having a lot of cares with children and home and administrative and etc. But at the same time, how can we support this transition by giving small things step by step? So this step by step approach is really important. And if you think about lifelong learning, how can we build in these modular trainings, for example, that are really flexible, that you can step in and step out? And we see that our labor market's really rigid. So it's not adapted to these families in vulnerable situations. So how can we build in these step-by-step things to try on work and try on training? How can we validate these things that they learn, informal things also? And another thing that came, it's really interesting, is the need for perspective. So especially families or women that are in poverty, it's not easy to take a step into the labor market. For us, it seems easy, but for certain people, they have to know what does it mean for, it's not about just about income, but what does it mean, like David said, childcare costs, mobility. Do I need a car? Do I have other costs that I need suddenly? And what if I step in? What is the impact on the income of my partner? Do I need to look for babysitting because the hours are not good? So all these questions and simulations, you don't take them easily if you are in a poverty situation. You need to have a little bit of certainty, because you have the risk that you lose all your social benefits. So perspectives on, if you take this step, this means that, and if you take these small steps, then you will arrive afterwards, when your children are, for example, bigger, then you can work on this, but work on your skills now, and this is what it means for your financial and fiscal situation, for example.
Fatima, that was a very, very good point, actually. About this modular approach. That actually for migrant women, it's even more important than for any other migrant, than for migrant men, to have a modular approach to the integration issue because of the interruption that they may face. Olga, would you like to add anything from your perspective to this important issue?
Yes, thank you. It's a really good and important question. When you arrive in a country, especially with your family, integration can be a really long process, with different priorities and challenges at different times. For example, at Mosaic, we've seen that majority of our clients have been in Canada for less than 5 years, but we serve many who have been in Canada for 10 and 15 years. So as David and Fatima mentioned, that the intervention and accessing of programming happens throughout the life journey. For newcomer women, is often being able to just navigate the country in the new language, and making sure that their children are well adapted in preschools, in daycares, in schools. But the next priority often is a little bit more formal language training or employment training, upskilling. And historically, most of this has been done it's almost like classroom based. You need significant uninterrupted time blocks to complete each day. And we found there's really major barriers especially for newcomer women accessing this type of training. Of course, available childcare is one of them, but also the ability to even take time off work for upskilling instead of continuing the work to support family, even if it's jobs that are significantly underutilized, the women's skills. And so it's not only about the timing of when the support programs and interventions happen, it's about the flexibility, how we deliver them. And we need to be able to experiment, which really means creating remote, maybe self-paced learning models for women who are at home with their children, combining language and skills training together, and introducing workplace instructions, introducing on-the-job learning and language training rather than the classroom-based training. And it's, as again, both Fatima and David said, it's really important to understand the needs of the students. When you schedule, the timing matters when in the day you schedule these sessions. You need to make sure that you will build the childminding costs into the system. Transportation costs were mentioned, but also financial aid to compensate for the lost wages during the training. We do see large strength of the mentorship programs, but not only as the initial tool to get the initial job, but as a long-term tool, helping women navigate the work culture and work environment and get the skills and actually have the opportunity to grow their careers over the time if they wish so. We see many newcomer women come back after they're established in a job to really give back to the communities that welcome them. They're looking for volunteer roles. They're looking for meaningful social and civic engagement. They want to have their voices heard in the decision-making tables. And then, as with many Canadians, life happens. We see the stress that life in country, and that the changes to the gender culture norms have on families. And we see newcomer women accessing some of our more specialized programs later in their integration journeys. Relationships and families fall apart. Newcomer women might be accessing our counseling, victim support programs, and legal advocacy programs. We see newcomer women tackling complex health situations, caring for other family members who might have mental health issues, seniors with dementia, and needing help accessing culturally sensitive health supports. So it is important to understand that the integration is not always a linear process. It requires a great deal of flexibility in the when, how. It's not a one solution that fits all. And good interventions need to recognize the unique situation, the needs of newcomer women at the various stages of the journey. But as Fatima said, the newcomer women should have a voice in designing these interventions.
That was interesting to see that again. The traditional settings and the traditional approach it's not working for many migrants, but it's particularly working for migrant women, as you said. And we need a lot more flexibility. One specific area of flexibility is, of course, should we have specific gender integration measures? And I would like to start with Jürgen again on that issue. What's the best idea? Should we have separate measures, introduction courses, for example, for women than for men? Or is that useful for empowering migrant women to make sure that access barriers are lowered, particularly for those who may have difficulties in a more gender equal setting? Or are we sending the wrong signal if we have separate measures for those groups? Jürgen, what is your view on that?
Working video. Thank you. Yes, this is a very important question, and what we need and what we have, and we have two parts. On the one hand, we have the regular system, and we have a lot of offers for migrant women together to learn with migrant men. We think that it is very important to find access to the families and to bring together and to look for the specific what the specific needs and as what they have for qualification. We have a long experience, for example, for the integration courses, and there we have special courses for women and for young people and so on. And what we learned is different. In some cases, it's very successful that we have a special room for women, and we can speak about the special situation, the special needs, what they need to come inside to the labor market or to the society or to work together. And on the other hand, it is very important to bring both together, to have the discussion between them. That is sometimes a little bit difficult, and it depends from the situation. It is very important that we have a high qualified people they promote this, and they bring this special programs to the migrant women and to the families, and bring together in the discussion. What we do in Germany, or what we have a long experience with good working networks. Networks work local, and they work in the whole Germany, and for example, the network IQ. And what we learned in this network is that it's very important to differentiate between what is the specific situation, for example, for a refugee that comes without the qualification, and what needs the migrant women which lives a long time here in Germany, and they had the focus from the family, they had the focus from the husband, or so on, or there are different problems inside the family. And so it is very important to make, before the program starts, a very view in the special situation for this woman, what they need. And I think, especially now, we in the moment for COVID-19, what we learned, for example, we have to offer more visual programs, and we have to find that or it's to work in the home office, and it is very difficult for some migrant women also to work in the home office, and to hold the same level as the colleagues, and work together with the colleagues in the field of in his working life and in his integration in the society and also in the companies. And though the main information or the main point is to develop different systems and to look what is the need the migrant women in the special living situation, and how we can bring that together with the offers from the government, from the local areas, from the NGOs, and what is the best access as very successful to do and how we can develop that in the future.
And also for mentioning this whole of family approach, which is perhaps good to take away as well. David, what are your views on this issue with respect to gendered integration measures?
Thanks for that. I think one thing I'd start with, and I'll make two levels of intervention. One more at the systemic or institutional perspective, and then really getting into some of the more specific programming offering. But I think from our perspective, knowing, and we've been having this conversation, knowing and acknowledging the different barriers that exist, between streams of immigrants, between even what families and the differentiated needs, allows us to really target and focus on the barriers and the inequities that that the programming is set to try to help. So I think from the institutional point of view, one thing, and this is not specific, of course, it's a bit of the gender-based analysis lens. And this is one where, IRCC, so our immigration ministry, it is a legislative requirement. We need to report to Parliament every year how we've applied some of this lens to our programs and policies. I say that not to talk about, why but the institutional sort of that frame and that, let's call it, requirement forces an ongoing thought process across our sort of the policy continuum and the programming continuum to make sure that, hey, do we have a good sense of what the barriers are and how they're evolving, and whether and how we need to adapt what we're doing in this space. And I think that brings me to the second sort of level then, from that sort of high level, what are we, making sure that we're aware, to the specific programming. And Olga in her first intervention spoke about something called the Visible Minority Newcomer Women's Pilot. And I think this is one where, for instance, I think allows us, and it's something that's in place now, really to look at how to support newcomer women to develop employment skills and find jobs through a combination of different kinds of interventions and tools. And I think that's the promise. And I think it speaks to, I think Fatima and Olga say, flexibility and trying to drive it from a client-centered perspective. What we're seeing from these pilots so far, that we're informed, like I think we look to include a newcomer women perspective and voice in terms of the design. And what we're seeing so far is a lot of what we're talking about today, that women are often newcomer women are often focusing on getting their family settled and their childcare needs dealt with first, which may delay the entry or changes the entry into the labor force. A second finding really around those client-centered supports and how they're key to helping newcomer women build their confidence, rebuild maybe confidence to enter and to sort of meet the workplace norms in the workplace and the requirements for more of a structure. A ton of things here in mentoring and peer networks that we see have big impacts, but also not just for the penetration into the labor market, but it's starting to get to the challenge that I think we see, and we see it in the statistics and the data. It's finding employment commensurate with one's experience, one's skills, and one's contributions. And I think that continues to be, I think, a challenge as we think through this space. And finally, the last thing I'd say in terms of what we're seeing from this pilot, but it speaks to a broader challenge we have. It's really around the role of employers and the role of the broader community. I mean, it's one thing for governments to speak and to our service providers. I think there's a lot of things that we know we need to do, but if we don't bring the rest of society and employers along to see the benefit, and often it's around that benefit lens, right? There's a labor market need. Here's untapped potential. I think that's a word you used, Thomas, at the outset. How do we tap that pool? But it's also, unless there's more systemic and systematic sort of conversation to bring the employer community into that conversation and see not just the value, but sort of it's the whole of society project. This is something that we really need that engagement to do. Then I think some of what we do as policymakers, there's a limit. So thank you.
David, that's actually a very good transition, the whole of society approach that you mentioned, to the last round of questions that I would to address. It's the issue of outreach, because there I think it's where the whole of society is probably needed most. One of the crucial issues is to get in touch with migrant women, and particularly those ones where we see the largest gap, where it's most difficult to reach, and some are quite difficult to reach. So what are some of the good practices that you are pursuing or have seen to tackle this challenge? And perhaps starting with Fatima. Fatima, what in Flanders and the VDAB, what are you doing in this respect?
Well, first of all, when I think about the successful outreaching projects, we have a lot of programs for outreaching. How can we find these migrant women that don't come to us? One of the lessons we learned, for example, is that you really have to invest in role models. We have a lot of projects that work with successful role models, because people, the migrant women, have to recognize themselves and have perspective on it. It can be done, and we tend to really always focus on migrant women newcomers, but we in Belgium at least, but I think in whole Europe, we still have an issue also with the second and third generation. We are not there where we want to be, and we are not visible. So how can we give them perspective and ask them to really go study and work, etc., when they don't see the example? So we have to invest in really good role models and success stories. But another really important thing for VDAB, at least, is know your place. There are a lot of when we did research on the so-called inactive women, like Olga also said, they're really active in informal networks, charity, voluntary work, etc. If you really want to reach them, you have to go locally and go into these informal networks. And in Belgium, you can see that there are like informal leaders in these networks. If you really want to reach them, you have to think about your position as VDAB. We don't have to be always on the front line. You have to respect the position of these networks, of these organizations, of this work, and you have to step in when it's needed, not immediately. Sometimes you have to wait until our role has to be played, when the people are really ready to take that step to the labor market. But sometimes all the work before that's really not to VDAB to come and organize that. So respecting the expertise of the local networks and the local organization. But another really important thing that we learned is when you have like an IT program, for example, and you really want to target migrant women, don't put that in your communication like, we want migrant women for this project. But behind the scenes, you have to do all kinds of investment. You have to target the right organizations. You have to go speak to the women, look at the barriers, etc. But on the scene itself, it's about IT. And so do all the investment, do all the effort to reach them, to how do you say it, lure them. But on the scene itself, it's about IT. It's about a certain skill. And that's really the psychological dimension that really works well, because not all the migrant women will recognize themselves just by seeing a migrant woman on the website, for example. So you have to have the right message. It's a message that does not see you as an issue or as a problem, but that targets your need or your potential. Like you said, you have to untap the potential. That message speaks. It speaks to the women themselves. But like David also said, what is the message that you bring out in the world? We have to have this message of positivity and strength and the appreciative way of seeing migrants as potential. And so that's really an important lesson that we learned from all these projects and investigations that we did.
I think it's a very important point that you made, that we shouldn't, in our program design, not repeat the stereotypes that we intend to address. Jürgen, in Germany also you have a lot of experience with this outreach in terms of role models and so on. What are some of the good practices that you're pursuing?
Yeah, I think that is important. It is an important first step to reach out the women and the migrant background and to be reached. That is, there are a variety measures that we believe out there have the justification. What I think is that we come together in the community, that we meet the migrant women in his community together with the same group from women that they bring together, and they work by site, and we have a special access to the problems from the authorities, from the governmental or from the labor market authorities, or on the other hand from the people in the NGO they help, and what we do. But the very, very good experience that we have in the moment is in the networks. We work together with a migrant organization, with a special organization. They need these people. They have the access in the communities. And for example, in the network IQ, there is a very important part are special programs led from the migrant organization, and they bring together the migrant women and the programs, and they develop the programs with a special what the migrant people needs, and the migrant women needs together, and we discuss. So it is important that we have a look in the eyes from the partners, from the women, and so that is very important. And the new point is also that we use the social media more. Yes, and that is a very important point, to find the access in the social media, to discuss, to have the access to the family situation more, and to difference between arguments what are racism and that we can discuss with this women about the special problems, and so we bring together with the programs, and they come inside the programs, and the programs goes in the families and help us with a special solution for the living situation in this field. Yes.
Olga, is that outreach also an issue in Canada in your work?
Yes, and actually we do have strategies for outreach. Often the outreach starts even before newcomer women come to the country. The Canadian government to resources for individuals who are just destined to arrive in Canada. So often the settlement process and support could start through a pre-arrival process that is quite successful. But once newcomers arrive, about a third of them access services of settlement organizations. And the biggest outreach tool is newcomers usually tend to connect early with their own ethnic community, where they get referrals to services that other members of the communities use. The ethnocultural communities in Canada are often well organized. They have social media accounts, they would have their newspapers, radio stations, they would book programming through multicultural TV stations. So settlement organizations like connected at the various ethnocultural communities, who often are the first to receive newcomers. So a lot of outreach happens there. But there is a vital role that others in the communities and our municipalities play. For example, at Mosaic, we would partner with school boards and with individual schools, especially in neighborhoods with high newcomer population, and they would often refer clients. We work with local libraries, community centers, health centers, city halls, so that they all are aware of the supports available to newcomers and can refer them. We partner with local business associations, boards of trade, to raise awareness among employers who are often actually looking for services to support family members of their immigrant employees. And we would work closely with local consulates, especially from the key source countries for temporary foreign workers in BC, again, to help promote the services available for their citizens once in the country. And we have just launched a new initiatives in the partnership with the city of Vancouver, where we're actually recruiting Canadians as volunteers to spread the word about the services available to newcomers through their own neighborhoods and social and professional networks. So it does take strong community partnerships and the constant awareness campaign among the partners about what's available to create appropriate support network for newcomers.
Also for mentioning that pre-arrival perspective, which is actually crucial for the whole outreach for migrant women in particular, because that's the moment when you can do that to kind of get the first foothold in there. David, you have the last word. But rather than just focusing on the outreach issue, I would like to hear from you a relatively short reply, as we're running out of time, with respect to what's the one thing from a Canadian perspective that you would bring, that would take, if I were to transfer one thing across the Atlantic to the EU, that's the one thing I would suggest them to do.
Well, thank you, Thomas. That's a tall order, and I don't know if I would go as far as pretend that I'll reinterpret your question and say what I've heard today is a lot of effort, and I think one lesson that we all continue to work really on is in that holistic, is looking at it at the continuum as a holistic process. I think we often, at least in the system we have, talk a lot about selecting. We select principal applicants, but the challenge we have really fundamentally is we don't settle the principal applicants. We settle in and we have to integrate the entire family, which includes the spouse, the dependents, the partners. And I think it's as if we do better, I think collectively at looking at that totality, then I think we might just have more success across our actual immigration program objectives as well. If the objective is to keep somebody in to attract and retain in a smaller center, in a region, in a specific a target employment kind of need, if we forget about the families and the children, odds are that the people will not stay. They'll look for other things. They'll look for opportunities. So I think that's it won't be a Canadian conceit. I think it's something that we all kind of continue to work toward together. Thanks.
Thank you, David. So we have run a little bit over time, but I think we have a little bit. We can perhaps finish 5 minutes after 5. So we'll start in about 3 minutes. We'll start the breakout session, so you have a little bit of time for transition. Just to recall, first the breakout sessions, there's going to be a session on education and training, recognizing, valuing, and building the skills of migrant women, which is moderated by Jürgen. Then we have the second one on employment connections, coaching and mentoring of migrant women, which is moderated by David. Then there's one on the addressing systemic barriers to the labor market integration of migrant women, moderated. And obviously for Fatima, the issue of self-employment and entrepreneurship options for migrant women. And during the breakouts, please unmute your camera and microphone, raise your hand, submit questions. This is supposed to be interactive. And we see all each other again at 4:57 to be precise, German precision. And looking forward to hearing back then from the interactive breakout sessions. Thank you. So I see everybody is back. Hello. Welcome back, everybody, from the breakout sessions. I joined one and there was quite a lively debate, and I believe many of you would have liked to continue the there's also some informal exchanges possible afterwards. But now I'd like to just give a very brief, perhaps 1 or 2 minutes, really not more, for very brief key takeaways from each breakout session as a way of concluding this this afternoon on the labor market integration of migrant women. So starting with Jürgen on the first breakout session on education and training, recognizing, valuing, and building the skills of migrant women. Jürgen, what are your key takeaways?
Too short for a very fruitful discussion. It was very short and briefly, and yes, the main point was we had information about our colleague from how worked the network IQ, how important is it to find the access to the special to the migrant women, how important is this to work together in the international cooperation. As a ministry, as a member of the German Ministry for Labor and Social Affairs, I can inform that we work a long time together with our Canadian partners, and we learned a lot from our Canadian partners. What can we do? And that was very important to create the program in 2012 for the development, the new law for recognize from foreign qualification. Yes, and that was, and then the time was was over, and we had. I think that is maybe the beginning of a discussion. We are open to follow this discussion in the field of individual, and yes, that's all.
Jürgen, over to the second workshop, which has been moderated by David and which was discussing the issue of employment connection, coaching and mentoring of migrant women. David, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, no, a very, again, I think the time was short, but I think a very good exchange when we talk about coaching and mentoring. And I think, maybe 3 or 4 points to make. The one, just the importance of coaching and mentoring as a one-on-one interaction, right? At the individual level, knowing role models, being able to even get hope around, especially getting over a traumatic or difficult experience. So moving from the one-on-one to the importance and the utility of group mentoring and networks in terms of showing and exposing newcomer women to a range of role models, but also helping people and give them a network of support to meet goals. The fact that in this program, this kind of interventions, one of the challenges I think we face in the Canadian context, definitely, I think probably more broadly, it's how do you deal with the informal, a lot of the informal competencies that come, so programs to sort of bring people in and give them work and integrate and integrate into the labor market when it's not necessarily a formal competence. So how do you sort of do that in a way that that makes sense, but also creates self-worth and value and a contribution. Fourth point was really around the role and the role of employers and partnerships to also be in that kind of mentoring relationship to try to create that connective tissue to see the value in the and the pool of talent, but also sort of be able to match and give that chance. And the last thing I would say, and this was an interesting kind of discussion around, we concentrate a lot on piercing and penetrating the labor market, but that the interventions may need to continue in terms of helping mentor, and coach through career progression, but also as a way to watch out and give tools and ways of getting out or addressing vulnerability or exploitation or negative experiences in the labor market, to make sure that doesn't become its own barrier to progression and to continued success. So thank you.
For these very interesting points, and I learned a new word, group mentoring. You never stop learning. The third workshop in your moderation hands on addressing systemic barriers to the labor market integration of women. Again, a big issue, difficult to address it in 30 minutes, but what are you taking away from that?
Very lively discussion. 30 minutes definitely wasn't enough. 3 key takeaways. Systemic racism and racial discrimination as a key systemic barrier. We see constant income inequality, significant pay gap for racialized women, especially migrant women and racialized women. 2 things, takeaways. One is the need to collect disaggregate race-based data so that we can actually monitor, and also the need for greater representation of migrant women and women of color in our institutions as leaders in businesses, as in media, in public services, so that migrant women see themselves represented. The second was a key barrier was a lack of recognition of international credentials, but even beyond the credentials and education, a lack of recognition of previous work experience. And we talked about the importance of things like mentorship to building networks, but even going beyond the role of employers, how we need to create opportunities for through bridging programs, through paid internships, work experience opportunities, so that migrant women are able to get the experience and the networks in the new country. And the third one, we talked about the need to change the narrative and how women are portrayed even among service providers and policymakers, and change the narrative to come from the view of strength and assets rather than being the weakness and dependencies, and support for a lot of the grassroots efforts in newcomer communities that are over migrant women, so empowering migrant women, potentially providing some funding and support for the initiatives that are organically happening in the communities.
Thank you very much, Olga. That sounded also very interesting. And last but not least, to Fatima on employment and entrepreneurship options for migrant women.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really interesting breakout session and discussion. I try to focus it on 3 elements that I take away and that we should take away. First of all, the first is that mostly migrant women will start self-employment because of the difficulties to enter the labor market and the difficulties to start in employment, where they have the skills, the competences, diplomas from the country in origin, but it's not really recognized or validated. So, and the same thing happens with, for example, with the banks. They don't have enough confidence. They ask a lot of backup financially, etc., on guarantees that you don't always have when you enter the country. And that's why it's easily to start in an informal way, self-employment, for example, catering in a small context. But at a certain point, you grow, and then you have to see where can I get the right support, and that support is not enough provided. The programs that are there don't provide the right support for these kind of women. For example, when you have the integration policies and instances, they don't know enough. They don't emphasize enough on self-employment, so they don't have this information and they don't give it to the migrant women. That's first. And secondly, we have some innovative projects that we have to go beyond just the classic program, but think about combinations like learning and the language and entrepreneurial skills at the same time, for example. So create these paths that answer the needs of the migrant women. And thirdly, it's about role models, the successful role models, successful migrant women who have their own businesses. They could help in coaching the other migrant women. And then the last one, which I find really interesting, is the added value that these these projects bring, to recognize it in terms of public authorities. When you are writing tenders, give them some priority or recognize them in some way to give them a boost. So these were the main takeaways for me.
Fatima, I'm not trying to summarize now in 1 minute all the things that were discussed during this afternoon, during Switch afternoon. I think the one thing that I take away is that there's no one size fits all. We know that always from integration work, but it's especially true when it comes to migrant women and their integration to the labor market. So I think we need a lot more, and I think that was very obvious from all of the things that we have learned here today. We need a lot more flexibility in the approaches. And rather than taking a gender perspective, we probably need more of what somebody called, we need a whole of family perspective on labor market integration issue. And the unused potential is mainly in the long-standing migrants, which are often a little bit forgotten. The migrant women who have been around for quite a while. We do a lot of programs, we've seen a lot of things on new arrivals, but there's perhaps not enough attention paid to that group because in the past there was not as beautiful offers as we have now today. But thank you very much to the organizers for having organized this rich afternoon, and a special thank you to all the 4 panelists here today who have shared their rich experiences. And we hope that this continuation, that this exchange between Canada and the EU on this crucial issue, which is important not only for labor market integration of migrant women, but which is important for integration of migrants and their children in general, and as such, for social cohesion in our days, and now more important than ever, that this conversation will continue beyond today. Thank you very much.